Good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure to chair this evening's segment on gender, entitled Speaking Truth on Gender. But before we move on to gender, I just want to take a minute to discuss what I see as a systemic weakness in government and historical factors that make this country vulnerable to ideologically driven laws and policies. And we've heard a lot of people already ask today, why Ireland, why now? And I'm just going to try and address that briefly. Earlier today in the Dáil, the EU Migration Pact was pushed through in 3 hours, and it will be guillotined in the Seanad tomorrow in a really aggressive disregard for democracy and process. And in the olden days, as my children call the 80s, 90s and noughties, we were a poorer country, but arguably with serious politicians, except for a few notable exceptions who are here tonight. Our politicians would have taken a position, on legislation like this, the Irish position, and they would have lobbied and briefed parliamentary committees, briefed the media, and then fought it out in the chamber. And nowadays, it's like they stand mute like foie gras geese with their feet nailed to the ground, ingesting a kind of conveyor belt of EU legislation, often unwanted legislation that's not wanted by the people at all, but they transpose this without question. It's like the job of the legislature has become merely to cut and paste. And I think they see their role increasingly as just promoting Ireland as the best little country, the best little progressive country in the world, and they will really do anything for that pat on the head. The ruling liberal elite are intoxicated by some sort of vision of us as a people casting off our dark Catholic past. Now, while 70% of our laws do come from the EU, we do have an even greater problem, which has been touched upon by previous speakers. It's clear to me, really, that Ireland has become a sort of petri dish for increasingly unhinged, hard-left policy, because if it can be rolled out here, it can be rolled out anywhere. Why is this? Well, it's a number of reasons. The legislative framework has already been discussed. But, on a simple, basic level, we're English speaking. We have a very strong rule of law. We have a stable economy. We're friendly, happy, easygoing, likable. It's a great PR win. But more importantly, that new law or radical policy can be used as a marker and referred to as a model law to lobby for more laws in other jurisdictions. And that is the playbook. I founded the Countess to highlight the impact of one of such of these laws on society, a law that meant a radical reordering of society, the Gender Recognition Act, but it was passed by the Dáil without division. There was no vote in this country for full self-ID, which by definition has no gatekeeping whatsoever built into it. And this was due to the complicity of the mainstream media, which really had laid the ground for an official narrative which told us about the most vulnerable minority and how they needed this so they could be who they truly were. And so it passed. But of course, you cannot change your sex. And of course, there are obvious issues with allowing any man who wants to identify into any female space, service, prison, or sport. And from the moment that we launched in 2020, there has been an aggressive effort to silence us, both from government, from the NGO sector, and from the media. Collectively, you could call them the bubble. Immediately after we launched, and after a few weeks, a letter was authored by 40 NGOs calling on the media not to platform us and politicians not to represent us. We have been smeared and slandered from the floor of the Dáil by TDs in obvious abuse of absolute parliamentary privilege. We were described as a fringe hate group of transphobes, and hate pieces have been written about me and my extended family. There have been physical attacks on our attendees at our events. Our TikTok was banned for hate. just hours after the government task force on the referendum, TikTok task force on the referendum was launched. And I must point out that we had put out lots of hard-hitting videos prior to this about men in prison, about men playing female sport, and none of them were ever taken down. So I think that's a curious, coincidence that these were just 3 videos giving the counter-narrative view on the referendum. You've heard a lot about hate crime already today, but I would just add my own point that I do feel very strongly that what hate crime legislation, if it's enacted in its current form, will make our discourse unlawful. Because the way it's constructed, the provision, there's an inherent lack of symmetry in the provision. Because in this country, we need a debate on the conflict of rights. But only one point of view is protected by the provision. The other side, the other discourse, is criminalised. And I would add to Senator Mullen's submission about the new definition of gender. This novel definition of gender is, in my view, a further attempt to completely dismantle the meaning of sex in law, and we must resist that. We've been attacked really from all sides, and often the horizontal attacks from within the movement can be often as bad as anything else that we face, as I'm sure my panellists will attest to when we sit down for a chat. So it's undoubtedly, it is a hostile environment, but despite all this, I have to say, and effectively working in a media blackout, certainly in terms of legacy media, RTE and Virgin Media, I have some good news. We have been asked by the UN to present two different committees of the UN twice in the past 4 months, including to the Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, Reem Assalim, our sports working group who are here tonight, presented to her recently last week. Our grassroots thank you. Our grassroots referendum campaign for the no vote helped bring about the greatest ever defeat of a constitutional amendment in the history of the state. And the arguments that I formulated and that we ran throughout the campaign for 7 weeks were picked up and covered by international commentators like Tucker Carlson and Ian Hurst Ali. So the message does get out there locally, regionally, and globally. Our campaign, these words belong to us, raise public awareness and ultimately prevent the government from removing the word woman from maternity legislation in this country. And we have stopped the rollout of mixed-sex toilets in schools in Ireland. I believe we're the first gender-critical group in the world to bring forward legislation to amend the Gender Recognition Act so that it is unlatched from prison, so we can remove men from female prison in this country as a matter of absolute urgency. It's an emergency. So my message really is one of hope. This is an information war after all, and I do believe if you can get your message out, despite the censorship, the infrastructure of censorship, the organs of state that are grinding against you, you can make great strides and you can move the dial. And without further ado, I would like to introduce my panellist. Stella O'Malley is a best-selling author, psychotherapist. And she is the founder and director of Genspect International. And we were joined also by comedy writer Graham Linehan, author of his memoir, Tough Crowds. He's the creator of many hit TV shows, including Father Ted.
I got a bigger chair than you.
So firstly, Stella, like me, you sort of identified a problem in your particular field as a clinician, and you founded Genspect to address what you saw as an issue. So what made you take that approach of founding an organisation, and what attempts have there been to sort of silence you and to stop you doing the work you were doing, which is obviously counter-narrative and challenging the orthodoxy?
Yeah, as a psychotherapist, I'm not used to really, I think a lot of psychotherapists aren't used to kind of being on the front line of massive controversial issues. And when I did a film about gender issues in 2018, and it was a Channel 4 film, and it's quite noticeable really that all the mainstream media in England covered it, And nobody in Ireland covered it, by the way. It was a complete tumbleweed, and it was extraordinarily quiet on Irish Twitter. Nobody said really a word. While in England, everybody was tweeting about me and stuff. So it was an indication already that Ireland was strange about gender. But I think when we get in a world where the doctors and the psychotherapists and the psychologists are afraid to speak about clinical issues, we're in really, really dangerous waters, because our job is to help people who are vulnerable and to help them with our, in good faith, and with our training that we generally spend quite some years and some money trying to get that training so that we are good enough to be able to help them. And when I realised that an awful lot of psychotherapists agreed with me but were afraid to speak, it propelled me forward much faster as a result, because the extraordinary censorship we experienced making the film Trans Kids, It's Time to Talk, it was an absolute horror show. It was Soviet, to be honest. They were contacting Channel 4 on a daily basis. They had no information on me at the time because I hadn't done anything on gender. The entire premise of the film was, this is a newbie, she's a psychotherapist, she had some gender issues as a kid, let's see what she thinks. So they couldn't dig up anything on me, and yet they spent, like, when I say they, I'm talking about trans activists, they spent months and months and months contacting Channel 4 with various different attacks to get that film shut down. In the end, it was shown in November 2018. And like I say, it propelled me forward because of the savage tactics they had used in this year. I'd never seen the like of it, and I actually thought that day was over. I didn't realise such censorship was actually happening. And some years later, as a result of so many clinicians contacting me, and so many people who were lost in the wilderness, who were, maybe they medically transitioned and they wanted to transition back but they couldn't, I realised, wow, we're sitting on some sort of extraordinary situation here, and something needs to be done. And at first I just started a gender dysphoria support network, which was a therapeutic organisation. But then I realised this is much bigger than therapists, and this is much bigger than doctors. This is actually a cultural, political, legal and medical and media, obviously, issue. And so I started Genspect not as a therapeutic organisation, but as an organisation that seeks just to promote a non-medicalised approach to gender issues, so that people can be gender non-conforming but they don't need to medicalise, and that we're allowed to speak the truth about that without feeling that our speaking the truth is somehow hate speech. So, the reason I think more than anything that clinicians are afraid to speak up is because of the chilling effect that we've been talking about, that this chilling effect it's hammering people, and it's making people frightened to speak. And it's very, very worrying that Ireland in particular seems to have lost its nerve in many ways. It's great that we're having this event. I think it's bringing attention to it. But like, the Irish clinicians have tried to speak up, Donal O'Shea and Paul Moran have tried to speak up out in Loughlinstown. They're not getting much traction in the mainstream media. It's really noticeable. And then we've got it looks like, other than your good self, Leisha, and maybe other lawyers here, it looks like the Irish lawyers have been asleep at the wheel. Somehow, self-ID got into Ireland when nobody was looking in 2015, and, the Gender Recognition Act got in, and, men got into female prisons. The Conversion Therapy Act is in danger of getting in. The hate speech bill is in danger. So either the Irish lawyers are either being silenced or they're asleep at the wheel. I'm not sure. I'm sure, Leisha, you can tell us. But I do know the Irish clinicians are being silenced.
I would say that they do approach me secretly and offer support, but there's definitely a younger woke brigade, certainly in the law library, and it is also part of the sort of information and the sort of liberal elite information class as well. I think it's become normative, those views. But turning you now to Graham, what was the thing that first made you speak out, if there was a moment or if it was just a general sense of, this is wrong, I must say something? And what approach did you take? I mean, obviously you've got a huge following online and with your Substack and your show on YouTube. And what was the sort of tactics used to silence you from the beginning and through the period that you have been speaking out?
Well, there were a few things that happened around the same time that made me, I kind of dipped my toe in, thinking that wouldn't get me in too much trouble, by sharing an article by Heather Brunskill-Evans, which did all the usual things that those articles did in the early days. It first of all set out that this was nothing against trans people, that this is a concern for women's rights, etc., etc. It was a very evenly written, compassionate article, and I sent it from my hospital bed because I had a spot of cancer, but they got rid of it, and someone immediately replied, "I wish the cancer had won." So I kind of suddenly thought, oh, okay, this is not going to be. That didn't convince them. I'll try something else. How about this article? That didn't work either. I went on TV and explained my views. That didn't work either. No matter how many times I explained it, and this is what I try and get across to people who complain about my tone, there is no volume quiet enough that you're allowed to speak about this issue. They have, I mean, I don't think you can really destroy a billionaire, but they've made a bloody good attempt with J.K. Rowling, you know, taking her name off schools and stuff like that. That's stuff that's designed to be hurtful, you know. And so, you know, but then as things were going on and I was losing opportunities and things were getting worse and worse and the tensions were growing with my wife, who very rightly, you know, wants to know where the money was going to come in, I just had a series of different, for instance, I met one therapist who worked with children. And she said she had children coming in tears because they believed that J.K. Rowling wanted to kill them. Their favorite author wanted to kill them. And she said, and I can't tell them it's not true because they might report me to my accreditation authority. I met another guy who said that he used to be an alcoholic and he successfully beaten it. But he had just come back from a 2-week bender because his daughter he could not convince his daughter not to take testosterone. And he said she was disappearing in front of his eyes. Her jaw was growing and all the secondary sex characteristics were coming in. And I just couldn't ignore those people. Actually, I have a funny story about your director.
Go on then.
I hope it's okay to tell this story. Hey! The director of Stella's show got a phone call from his best man at his wedding, who had been told by his wife that he must never speak to him again. You know? So, I don't know, it was a combination of, I just kept thinking, I think another thing is, I think sometimes Irish people were a bit stubborn, and I think I'm very stubborn. And I took great pleasure in being a rock in the road for these people. Because I think what someone said earlier about them being terrible people, they are the worst people online, you know. The ways they get to people are through things like shaming, through, loads of people got messages, direct messages saying, why are you still following Graham Linehan? Don't you know he's this and that? And of course, to destroy someone's livelihood, as they almost did, is, I think it's the next best thing to killing them. Because if you can't make money, how are you supposed to live? So I don't know. I just kept going, and every time I doubted myself, which was often, because literally everyone is telling you you're wrong, I just thought of that woman who can't speak to the kids that she's giving care to that man who's lost his daughter, and the thousands of other kids kids out there like this. You know, and I'm so, one of the things that's I'd love to talk more about how the media covers this, because one of the things I pointed out recently was that Just Giving and websites like Just Giving, there were something like 60,000 campaigns started by young girls who wanted to remove their breasts. So Just Giving is basically full of these girls who want to remove their breasts. What's it called? Begins with B. The Irish website.
Belong to.
No. Sorry, it's a more newsy one.
Boards.
It's not Boards either. Oh shit. There's some website apparently makes a habit of doing this, and he just checked it and found a few that weren't about that. What?
Anyway, let's move on.
That's going to kill us all for the rest of the night. And he wrote this piece saying Graham Linehan's claim debunked. You know, that's still out there. That's on this website saying broadsheet. That's it. Yay. Yeah. So that's out there saying that this is debunked. But like, maybe it's not 63,000. But even if it's half that, even if it's 10, that's something that should be stopped. It's evil to tell young girls that they'll be happier if they cut off their breasts, or they'll be more who they are if they cut out their breasts. This is an evil, I don't usually use words like this, but it is an evil movement, you know? And the very... And the surest sign of that is that the very people that they've said they're protecting, in other words, people in the LGBT, are the ones they're harming. There's a whole generation of gay kids who will never know what it's like to have sex, what it's like to have a romantic partner and have a sexual relationship with them because of this movement, you know? So every time I ask myself that question, I just thought, I don't know what else I could do.
I wanted to say, you know, to your point about what sort of drives you, and I think it's fair to say that we're all driven to give so much of our time and our life to this battle. And this is really often framed as a culture war, and I think that's so minimizing, and it's part of the battle for language, because, you know, what you're describing, and I totally agree with you, this is a battle to save a cohort of extremely distressed, vulnerable, most times gay young people from horrific medical procedures and lifelong, complications. I recently spoke to a detransitioner who told me that when they had surgery, they asked the physician, the surgeon, if they could freeze their breast milk. That is the level of capacity and consent that we are dealing with in terms of their ability to understand what they are giving up by having these procedures.
There was one story in the WPATH files where a doctor said to another doctor, there's only one person and she used the word regrettably, I regrettably had to refuse cross-sex hormones. And it was someone who was having a psychotic episode during the consultation. That's who they regrettably couldn't. And there was another homeless person who they were going to give the surgery to, and they were worried because they thought, how'll they keep the wound clean on the streets? They're transitioning homeless people. So, do you know what I mean? So, it's not the idea of calling it a culture war is simply used by people like Keir Starmer to not think about it. You know, it's the only use of that word.
As we've sort of said on numerous occasions already today, this is about language, you know, and Orwell sort of said that first. But, you know, biology obviously has not changed, so it really is a fight for language. And to you, Stella, firstly, like, has your policy on language changed, or do you feel like, you know, it's sometimes people tell us as campaigners or gender-critical campaigners that we've hardened, but I think there's a sense of we need to speak honestly and truthfully in terms of the terms that we use. I mean, in the Countess we had very, like long conversations at the beginning when we were scoping, like, will we say trans woman? And we said, no, we're never going to say that, because that's just meant to mislead people. People immediately think of a woman. But we decided on trans-identified male. Then if they were in prison, we said men who say they're women, and sometimes now we'll just say men, you know. So we have obviously changed. In terms of language, did you have a sort of language policy, and did that change over time as the kind of movement changed and and the field changed?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting what's going down with the language. At Genspect, I suppose we're, more than anything, we're linking free speech as much as we're linking the issue around gender, because we think it's incredibly important that everybody's free to speak as they wish. So our fundamental is don't police other people's speech. Our fundamental is you have to have the freedom to speak as you wish. And if people want to argue with you, and if people want to, you know, argue with the words you use, they're fully entitled to. But if we live in a world where people can kind of tut-tut and constantly harangue you and harass you to use the right words, in a way we're losing the truth of the communication. And the truth of the communication matters more than the actual words somebody uses, because sometimes people are from different countries, they're from different cultures, they're from different places. And I think we have to give a bit of freedom around people's ability to speak. I think it's becoming incredibly pedantic on Twitter and or X, as they say. And I think it's more important. That's why I'm so kind of pleased this is a free speech event that is bringing in gender, because I am finding the gender world increasingly hardline and a lack of understanding around the importance of free speech, which is a cornerstone and a fundamental to a civilization. And from free speech, we would have the ability to speak about, for example, doctors could speak about how one should treat somebody with gender issues, or psychologists and psychotherapists could speak about how they should manage the treatment of some kid who's come in and they're severely autistic and they want to be called, you know, Aidan, but their actual name is Mary or whatever. We need to be able to speak about this really freely rather than stumbling over what is the fashionable phrase to use right now, because frankly it's going to change, and it'll change again and it'll change again, and you'll always be on the back foot if you're chasing the right phrase. And I've noticed that with schools in particular, that lots of teachers, they were trying to use the right language and were falling all over themselves. And very quickly, as teenagers would, teenagers saw it as a way to gain power over the classroom. And they were very quick to correct teachers who were using the wrong gender or the wrong name or the wrong, because they'd say, oh no, she's changed her name. And so they were very quick to kind of take control from the teachers in that way. And so we have to just push back on anybody who's trying to police our language and say, no, I'll use my words, you use yours. You don't have any right over my words.
I suppose really that's the crux of the matter, you know, in terms of free speech, that you may, you know, the man standing before you may believe he's a woman, but he doesn't have the right to force me or you to say he is a woman.
It reminds me, remember Fergal Sharkey, the guy he was from Derry, he was the singer. What was it? Yeah. And he said, you know, he was talking about Londonderry and Derry. You can call it whatever you want, and I can call it whatever I want. And he was very strong on that, and he was quoted all over the place for that, because he was saying, I'm going to call it Derry, you can call it Londonderry. Your job is to do you, my job is to do me. And I think we have to really protect a hard boundary around that.
And the BBC, of course, famously, their solution was to call it Londonderry, Londonderry, wasn't it?
But
would you like to come in there on just the media and what, you know, their role in this? Because I would see them very much, Graham, as a pillar of this ideology, not just kind of a player, but really a pillar of gender ideology in the culture.
Yeah, absolutely. RTE and the BBC are doing everything they can to avoid this subject. It receives no serious coverage. GB News has to be congratulated, and Andrew especially. For having a series of people on, including doctors and therapists and lawyers and all sorts of people, who, if they were appearing at an event like this and word got out, people would be banging on the doors, you know. And the media has kind of allowed this situation to arise because they just will not report the real issues on this. And the real issues are, you know, the mass misdiagnosis of gender non-conforming kids. You know, the real issues are men in women's sports, in women's prisons, and so on. And you know, someone was saying it's an elitist project. It is only the elites that believe in this stuff. You know, you don't see working class kids fiddling with their gender. It's a middle class. I walked into that one. It's a middle class project, and the people who are ring fencing it are the media. They've behaved disgracefully on this issue, you know. Like, if early on someone had said something like, I don't know, you know, well, there are obvious problems here, we have to talk about them, then I might not have lost, you know, my marriage, my career, but no one did. Not a single person. It's just been, well, you know, obviously there's exceptions, but if you look at RTE, 2 years ago that Joe Duffy program was on, and they got such crap for it, and they haven't done anything since. The issue has just dropped off the map again.
On that subject, like in 2019, January 2019, Primetime did a show on gender. You and me were on it. And so
they protested outside, including Amnesty.
Yeah, and the protests were clown show protests. There was a lot of Father Teds. And there was one, I was talking about it earlier, there was a memorable kind of sign across the M50, which is, no lists, more tits.
What?
They didn't want any more waiting lists. And they wanted to pretend that kind of rhymed with tits. But it didn't.
That is like a banner I would put up. More boobs is always good policy.
On that subject, I think, you know, we could almost, you know, forgive, let's say, the clinicians who are afraid they might have it wrong, and that this is, you know, gender's come in like a rocket and people don't really understand it. You could not really forgive the lawyers for being asleep at the wheel and allowing vague, badly worded laws coming into the country and shaping our policies. But you definitely have to have a sharp eye at the media, because why did they become journalists? Mm-hmm. Yeah. They're supposed to be exploring both sides of the story. You know that famous quote, when one side says it's raining, the other side says it's dry. You don't report that. You look out the window. What is it? You look out the window. You stick
your hand out the window and see if it gets wet. That's I think the quote.
Yeah.
But they even weaponized, they weaponized, the trans activists have always been very clever. They weaponized the both sides thing by what they would do is they would agree to an interview on the BBC with, say, Helen Joyce, and then they would pull out, and the BBC would ring Helen Joyce and say, oh, sorry, we're not doing it because we can't find an opposing voice, you know. So they would do that all the time. So some of the problems that we're talking about are problems to do with this particular subject.
Yeah, there's structural weaknesses within broadcasting for sure, because it gives the same credence to both sides of a debate, and that can be weaponized.
These people, one of the ways to look at it, one of the thought exercises I tell people is, like, you know, we would have to be very naive to think that Jimmy Savile was unique, you know, that there aren't any more men like Jimmy Savile. If this world was ruled by a bunch of Jimmy Saviles who were able to coordinate online, how would that world look different to this one? You know.
Could I add to that, you know, when you think of the censorship that's going on, I think one word that kind of covers it would be autogynephilia, because so few people seem to know what this condition is. It's a man's erotic fixation on being perceived as a woman. There's a few different variations of the definition, but it's pretty much that. So it's a paraphilia, and there isn't very many paraphilias. Well, there's some, but they generally cause a lot of trouble. So let's say a few paraphilias would be voyeurism or exhibitionist disorder, or obviously paedophilia. There's a few different paraphilias. Autogynephilia is a paraphilia. It's well established. It's been kind of in the DSM for many years. It was first kind of classified in 1989, or first described. And yet so few people in the world know that word. They don't even know what it means. They don't know about it. And I'm like, well, that's a very successful form of censorship, because everybody should know about that word, because that means if somebody comes, and if it's a man, and if he has medically transitioned or is presenting as a woman, there is a significant chance this person has autogynephilia, and I'd like people to know that. Just to know what they're dealing with, for no other reason than we need to know who people are, and we need to know what we're dealing with, especially around paraphilias.
And really, what we're dealing with is a kind of new landscape whereby in the past those men were known as transvestites, and there was one in towns and villages all over Ireland, but no one was ever expected to believe that they were women and that they should have access to female toilets or intimate spaces or prisons. I think there's time for one or two questions now from the audience who were sent in by Twitter.
So we got time for one question. I'd like to hear just a brief response from each of you maybe before we go on to the next panel. So how is the Twitter bullying and just bullying in general that you've all received for standing up on this issue, has it affected your ability to get your message across? Has it ever made you think, maybe I shouldn't be doing this?
Yeah, without a doubt. Because Twitter is for quick responses, and yet, and sometimes the lack of forgiveness around a quick response. You're getting kind of people are screenshotting me and showing some stupid, badly worded tweet I did 4 years ago. It's made it a really, really suppressing, oppressive place. It's horrible.
Yeah. I don't even know where to begin with that. What I would say is that it's not so much Twitter that's the problem for me. The problem is, for instance, Wikipedia has been lying about me for 6 years and I can't get it changed. Whenever the press reports on me, it's always a negative thing that happened rather than any of the things we have achieved. So, as far as I'm concerned, someone writing that, you're divorced on Twitter doesn't really bother me. But being misrepresented to such an extraordinary degree, in the sense that, like, I went to Australia recently, and they almost didn't let me in, and it's because I'm saying there's two sexes, So I don't know. I feel like sometimes the worry about the hate speech, I do think it's a real worry, but I would remind us all, we already live in a world where it is very hard to tell the truth, So it's not so much beating this particular bit of legislation. It's rowing back on a lot of things. I'll just one tiny last point. One of the things I would suggest everyone does is whenever anyone says trans people, just ask what they mean by that phrase. I've never seen a movement gain so much ground without defining what exactly they are. It's absolutely extraordinary. And as Stella says, you're mixing in people, like there's young girls who have severe dysphoria, and autogynephiles who like thinking of themselves in a skirt, They're two very different groups, and they need to be talked about differently. But we're not allowed to do that at the moment because the word trans is this all-encompassing nonsense word that is meaningless,
I'd like to second that. When I'm asked, but Leisha, do you think trans people should not exist? I always say, well, I don't accept the premise. What is a trans person? People with the diagnosis of gender dysphoria exist for sure. But so I think it is a language war. To your point about how does it make me feel, like I've always felt from the very beginning, I'm not here to win over the true believers. That's not our message. We're here to speak to Middle Ireland, and 9 out of 10 of those people agree with us already outside the bubble, and that is, I absolutely firmly believe that. And we often take our message, outside Dublin to the streets, to the towns, to the villages. We do info stalls, and we're mobbed. Our message resonates. I just wanted to, before we conclude, give a shout out to Grip Media who are here, because we're slamming. Fatima Gunning is here, who is an incredible investigative journalist, and John McGurk, who's not here, but is the editor of Gript. I mean, they were the news outlet who were prepared to go against the court order banning any publication of the news of Barbie Kardashian when that man was going to prison and was sent to a female prison. And they were the only news outlet in all of Ireland who were prepared to breach that. Thank you.
I used to go to war with various members of Gript during the referendum on abortion.
In your woke phase.
Yeah, and today I saw David Quinn, and I forgot that I probably insulted him more than any other person online. And I was like, "Oh, David, how's it going?" I forgot what his connection was with the whole thing. So sorry, David. I have actually had to apologise to a lot of people for my woke phase. Seriously,
So that concludes our segment on gender. It was a great honour to chat to both of you, Graham and Stella. Thank you so much. It was a great conversation.